We have a lot to cover in today's video, including some arbitration awards for Toronto Maple Leaf goaltender Ilya Samsonov and Hawks forward Philip Kurashev. Plus, with the Leafs being in such a tight cap situation, we're going to discuss how this is going to spin off on some other moves they might make, talking about some trade rumors affecting their roster for them to be cap compliant when the season starts. Plus, we also have news out of Boston that they've terminated the contract of Mitchell Miller. We'll discuss that situation and more coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, we have a lot to cover today. Before we get into the arbitration award and the spin-off effects from those contracts, I do want to talk about the situation that we learned about earlier today, a few hours back, with the Boston Bruins, courtesy of Larry Brooks and the New York Post. So there's an article today posted in that publication talking about how we recently learned that Mitchell Miller, of course, who was the controversial signing by the Bruins earlier this past season, who was signed to a 3-year entry-level contract, has been terminated. Now, in case you're not familiar with this situation or you don't remember, essentially what happened was Mitchell Miller was a drafted prospect of the Arizona Coyotes a few years back. After the draft was completed, though, there was a bit of a backlash against the Coyotes for picking this player. Many teams had Mitchell Miller on their do not draft list. So Mitchell Miller, at age 14, was convicted of assault and violating a Safe Schools Act, where essentially he was, I guess you could say, what they called racially motivated acts against one of his classmates who was also developmentally challenged, essentially, picking on him and, assaulting him in different ways. And obviously, that was not a good look for him. So a lot of teams had him on their do not draft list, and I guess a lot of teams agreed that they wanted to see him go through a lot more work to show that he's learned, changed, and of course at that point there was still also not much evidence that he had ever really sincerely apologized. Just a whole ordeal of situations involving this player. And then of course after the Coyotes had renounced their draft pick, so they gave up all association with them shortly after the draft, and then out of the blue during this past season, I believe it was about around the halfway point of the year or so, the Boston Bruins announced that they signed Mitchell Miller to a 3-year entry-level contract. Took a lot of people by surprise. Now, this kid does have talent on the ice, but there's obviously a lot of concerns and about his off-ice character and whether or not he's put in the work and was going to be allowed to even play. Now, I believe under the scenario that Gary Bettman had issued a statement saying that the NHL and Bettman had to rule on it to even give him consent to even play in the NHL. Now, the team itself did not take well to this news. Many of the NHL Bruin veterans had spoken out against the signing and put pressure on the Bruins to not proceed, even though he was signed. And of course, in one of those entry-level contracts, you get signing bonuses, American Hockey League salary, NHL salary, because they're two-way deals. But they didn't want anything to do with him. They didn't feel like they had enough evidence to show that he had matured, done the work, and all the things that they felt he needed to do to get an opportunity. So they put pressure on the team, and then within a short time after, they came out and they announced that they were not going to be affiliated with them anymore. Essentially, the contract, though, most of us kind of wondered, well, what does this mean for the contract? Obviously, it's a legal document. They've agreed to pay him money. Do they need to go through a termination process? Do they have to put him on unconditional waivers? Do they need to do a buyout? Is this going to affect their salary cap? How is this going to work? Well, now we learn essentially that not long after this process began, when they announced that they didn't want to proceed and didn't want to have him a part of the organization after they changed their minds after the backlash against them as well, it sounds like they started the process of discussing with him and his representative legally how to mutually agree to kind of make it go away. He didn't really require waivers because this was something that was mutually agreed upon. Outside of that, obviously he had never played in the NHL, so it's believed that they agreed to a settlement. So they did have to end up paying him something. I'm going to go on the assumption that whoever is representing him is going to say, okay, at the end of the day here, even if he never played a game in the NHL, he would have been guaranteed 3 years of American Hockey League salary, which I believe it was like 80,000-90,000, and he was getting a signing bonus every year. So I would imagine, I can't say with any certainty, we'll never know because I'm sure he had to sign an NDA, but it's probably had to pay some kind of an amount equal to what he would have been guaranteed in the 3 years, and essentially the contract's terminated. So they come to all those terms on their own, and apparently he technically hasn't been a part of the Bruins since like April, but nobody knew. Even CapFriendly, Puckpedia, who are very reputable websites for keeping up to date and all that, had no news to update their rosters or organizational depth charts to have him taken off. But New York Post and Larry Brooks have reported today that indeed was the case. So Mitchell Miller is again a free agent. So we'll see. But I do believe in order for him to sign anywhere and be able to play, I believe Gary Bettman in the NHL has to grant consent. Just like the Logan Mailloux situation and with Montreal, I believe he has to give consent there. And just like, Joel Quenneville and Stan Bowman are trying to gain employment again in the NHL, same concept there as well. So we'll see if we ever hear of Mitchell Miller again. At what point he's going to make another attempt, we don't know. It's believed he's most likely going to end up playing over in Europe, or at least looking for employment in the European leagues and see what he can find. I would suspect he's going to probably have to play over there for a few years and really show that he's done a lot of work and done a lot of effort into making himself better, and that he's learned from things before NHL teams will indeed give him an opportunity here, so to speak. I know when he was going through the whole situation with the Bruins, I know the victim's family was quite upset by everything. They felt that he was not sincere with his apology and was essentially trying to make amends just because the NHL contract was coming to be, and it was a whole big finagle. So obviously good on to see that the Bruins have kind of done the right thing here, and we'll see if we ever hear of his name in NHL circles down the road. Now, as I mentioned, we do have some arbitration rulings today. As I talked about in the last video that was up on the channel last night, I was suspecting that we'd get the Blackhawks and Philip Kurashev's deal announced sometime late yesterday, but it never came. Of course, we didn't have any announcements to say that it was being delayed or anything like that. I do believe arbitrators can sometimes ask for a little extra time. It's also possible that everything was sent through from the arbitrator and that maybe the team just didn't announce it until today, but we do know the result. So Philip Kurashev, now in his case, he can get up to a 2-year contract because he's not as close to free agent, like being an unrestricted free agent as Samsonov is. So he gets a 2-year deal, and it's $2.25 million. So at this point, the team had put in their arbitration filing for $1.4 million, where the player was looking for $2.65. So I think we can say Kurashev won this battle. It's a lot closer to what he wanted compared to what the team wanted. That's $850,000 higher than what the team was looking for, and only $400,000 less than what the player was looking for. So that's not exactly splitting the difference. So Kurashev wins his award, but of course the team selects to go 2 years on that, which totally makes a lot of sense anyways, given where they feel he's likely going to come. I know based on what he's produced, some are already saying and feeling that it's a bit of an overpayment. But I think to some degree, though, you have to look at the fact that as time goes on, he's going to get a bigger role. He's still young, still developing. So I suspect he should grow into this contract and hopefully make it work out well. But we'll see. As I mentioned before, there's a long history of showing that players that go through the arbitration process don't typically stay with the organization too long. I know in my research, and there's actually a new article which I have not had time to read yet, but I know there's an article from the Hockey News today talking about that. And if you've been following the channel here, I know it's been a little while, but it was about 2 years ago. I did research for the previous 10 years, looked at all the arbitration cases, all the contracts that were settled, and it was a very high percentage of those players were gone from those organizations within maximum 2 years. Typically, you get 1 or 2 year contracts out of arbitration, which explains a lot when those contracts come due. If not sooner, then they're usually either traded or just not re-signed, and that quite often happens to be the case. So we'll see where this goes, but the Kurashev contract, Chicago doesn't have a cap issue, so for them, even if they feel it's a bit high, it's really not a big deal. But the bigger news today, is Ilya Samsonov because of the spin-off effect and the Maple Leafs and their salary cap situation. So we're going to take a look at how it affects them and what other trades we could see coming from now. Of course, yesterday we talked about the fact that the Leafs are definitely confirmed to be in the mix for Erik Karlsson, and how I talked about the fact in that video last night that they're likely, if they want to pull that off, I personally don't see how they can do it without moving a significant salary like a William Nylander. And to me, I don't know if San Jose would accept something like that in return, but of all the teams that are in the mix, they are the only team, in my opinion, that have a player of that magnitude that makes any sense for them to move. So we'll see how that works out, and we're not going to get too much into the Nylander for Karlsson trading right now, but Samsonov's been awarded a 1-year deal at $3.55 million. Now this is, you can kind of call this one almost a draw in a sense, but the team was looking for only $2.4 million, but the player was looking for $4.9 million. So that's a big jump up. That's a $2.5 million gap to start with. It's $1.14 million higher than what the team was looking for, and it's $1.35 million less than what the player was looking for. So in a sense, the team came up a little bit less than the player dropped, so you could say maybe edge Leafs, but not really. I know it's pretty close to splitting the difference down the middle. A lot of reporters suggested that that's probably where things were going to go, and if you're going to run that 3.5 or so range, would be where he ended up, and that's what happens, 3.55. Personally, I think it's a very fair contract. I have no issue with the amount at all. I think based on Samsonov's performance last year, I think he more than earned that. I personally would have thought the Leafs and him could have come to terms on a longer-term contract. Even if they didn't want to go 7 or 8 years, I thought they could have went 3 or 4 years anyways and got him, maybe around, a little bit more money. I'm thinking maybe in that 4 to 4.5 range on a 4-year deal. I thought would have been fair. A 4 times 4, if they could have, I don't know if that's agreeable, or maybe, well, if the player was looking for closer to 5 on a 1 year, I'm guessing he probably wanted at 5.5 to 6 on a 3 or 4 year deal, which is, I guess you could maybe argue is a little bit too much, which explains maybe why they couldn't come to terms. But at the same time, you think they could have bridged that gap down and got it done ahead of time. But here we stand. So that's the award for Samsonov. So again, I think it's a fair contract. But here's the Leafs salary cap situation. I'm going to show you a snapshot from capfriendly.com as of right now. Now, keep in mind, as of right this moment, we don't know that Matt Murray is LTIR eligible. Elliot Friedman, the top insider of the game, Sportsnet writer, has confirmed for us that he thinks there's a possibility that the Leafs might not be able to perform a buyout on Murray and that he might end up on LTIR, which raises a lot of questions, considering that technically at the end of the playoffs last year, during that Florida series, he was available. He was deemed healthy and available. He was backing up, after Samsonov got hurt, he had to be available if he was going to be. And now I understand as well, when you're dealing with a injury history of concussions, the symptoms can come and go. Doesn't mean that, you think you're cleared. It doesn't mean that there's no chance of it coming back, right? So that's always a possibility. Maybe he went into off-season training mode. It re-aggravated something. We really don't know the full story there. All we know is what Elliot was saying, that he had heard that the Leafs might not be able to do a buyout. But because this contract is settled now, they do get a second buyout window. So if it's not Murray, they can buy out any player they want over $4 million, and we'll see what happens here over the next couple of days. Now, the window opens 48 hours after the contract comes through, so as of Tuesday afternoon, they will have a buyout window. So we'll see if they decide to move forward. If Murray gets put on unconditional waivers for the purpose of buyouts, we'll know he's healthy. And that is that. Now, if for some reason they try to buy him out and he and his rep feel he's not healthy, then we could see a grievance from the NHLPA, and that could really complicate things. But I suspect they'll do their homework to make sure that doesn't happen and they have a definite answer. But as of right now, we know the cap's $83.5 million. We know for sure they have Jake Muslin's contract that can go on LTIR, which is $5.625. So that gives us a total of basically $89.125 million. So that's what they can spend to, given the Muzzin contract alone. Now, they're way over that right now. They're well above that. So obviously, looking at the situation there, they're well above. So obviously, they're going to have to make some moves. I mean, right now with 13 forwards, 7 defensemen, and the 3 goalies on their cap, they're at $95.881 million. So even if Matt Murray is LTIR eligible, they're still not cap compliant. So they're not going to have a choice but to figure out a way around this, and it's going to be challenging without, that's why I really think we are going to see a trade. I don't know that it can be done without trading a player. Otherwise, they're going to go into camp and likely just putting players on waivers to lose for nothing and hope they get claimed. And if teams know they're up against the cap and they need to lose somebody to get compliant, they're probably going to not take them just to mess around with them unless it's somebody they really, really want, which it's hard to say that it is. Now, really, if you think about this, let's look at this in a couple of different ways. Okay, let's say Matt Murray is buyout eligible. So out of that 4.6, because you got to remember, Ottawa retained some salary in his contract. So they're on the hook for $4.687 million. So out of that, they would save just over $4 million on a buyout. They'd still have like $600,000, okay? So he comes off the books, but there's still a little bit of dead money there. So clearly, that's not going to be enough. There's still not going to be salary cap compliant. So with Matt Murray not being in the mix, and if he's bought out, they're still not compliant. And even if he is LTIR eligible, they're going to be about $2 million over. So it's not a huge rush. They can be 10% over during the off season. So they're fine in that sense. But if you take a look at what they got to do, like I said, they have 13 forwards, 7 defensemen. They can go to a smaller roster, but it's not that simple. They don't have the players that are waivers exempt anymore to really make that happen. Now, they have 2 forwards in Matthew Nyes and Holmberg that are both waivers exempt. But the problem is with those 2 guys is they both make under $1 million. Even if you demote both of them, they're not going to shed enough salary to be compliant. They would need to move a 3rd player, either through waivers or trade or what have you. You got Connor Timmins, might be a number 6 or 7 defenseman. He's making 1.1, so he might be a candidate. You got Sam Lafferty making 1.15 in the forward group. He might be picked for either waivers or trade over guys like Nyes or Holmberg. Yes, he's got a little more experience. He plays a different role. But at the same time, he's making more money. Contract, the Leafs roster situation here might be as much about what they make, more so than what they bring to the table and what their skill set is and where they play. It's just quite simple as that. Timothy Liljegren's making 1.4. For the longest time, of course, you had him being waivers exempt. You could just put him in the minors as much as it wasn't fair. You can't do that anymore. He's not exempt anymore. So he would need waivers to go down. So you put Timothy Liljegren on waivers, he's going to get snatched. Now, Timmins, Lafferty, I think Lafferty probably would get picked. Timmins is debatable. It's possible, though. It wouldn't shock me if he was. So, at the end of the day, getting a few players demoted is not really a problem solver here. So, personally, like I said before, I think we're going to have to see a trade. So, who is that going to be? There's been some talk about TJ Brodie, 1 year, $5 million. That could certainly help them a long ways in solving their issues. I know a lot of fans have been on Brodie or on the team about maybe moving Brodie, being unhappy with his performance in the playoffs, more specifically in the second round. And you know what? I understand. But at the same time, I think he was one of your better defenders overall in the whole season, regular season especially. He was one of your better defensemen. You move on from him. Who's going to replace him? You're going to end up downgrading. So I don't know. You got to be careful with what you do here. Be careful what you wish for. Then you get to the playoffs and you're going to be even weaker on the back end. I don't know about that. To me, the blue line could already stand to be upgraded, let alone downgraded. So you're playing with fire there in that sense. You might have to move a forward that you don't really want to, like a Calle Järnkrok. I mean, Järnkrok's a very versatile guy. They could move him, but is it really ideal? No. He can play top 6. He can play third line. I don't know. That's why some of the signings that they were making for some of these depth pieces and what they paid them, we're getting a lot of questions by people. And now, here we are. So at the end of the day, I do think we're bound to see something more significant. Like we talked before, and this is a circle back to William Nylander. They're not going to trade William Nylander strictly because they're tight up against the cap. That's not, they're used to this. They're playing cap gymnastics for several years. This is not a big deal to them. They have Brandon Pridham, who's one of the best in the game at doing the math and working his wizardry to make sure that they are cap compliant. But at the same time, it's a puzzle that's really getting trickier by the year to put together. And what are all the pieces and how does it all work out? It's almost like you go through training camp and you can't make your lineup based on what you think is absolute best because you have to go by what works for the cap. And that's not fair to some players. That's all you could argue. It's not fair to the team, but it's a position they put themselves in. So I don't think we can really have too much sympathy for them. But we'll definitely know in the next 48 hours if Matt Murray is buyout eligible or not. Because now they could also trade Matt Murray. They're likely going to have to include a sweetener. Some reporters have offered the fact that they think Nick Robertson might be a guy that they would be willing to part with to make that happen. So I know that's probably concerning for some fans, especially after they had to pay to get rid of Peter Mrazek and then to turn around short time after and to pay to get rid of Matt Murray. That's a bad, couple of years of assets to give away for bad signings. Look at Patrick Marleau. They had to give away a first rounder. That wasn't not long ago, really. Carolina got Seth Jarvis out of that. That worked out quite well for them. So you're either going to see, is it Yarncroke? Is it Brody? What do they do here? You want to probably move as few players as possible. And is Murray going to end up being a trade? Is he a buyout? Is he an LTIR? So many questions there we don't know. I personally think if he ends up an LTIR that there's going to be a ton of questions. I see a lot of fans of other fan bases today saying, well, how can he be eligible to go on LTIR when he was healthy and returned in the playoffs? And like I said, I get it. I understand it. It's hard to understand that as well. But when you're dealing with concussions, things can come up and happen. And we've seen players come back before in the playoffs and then later find out that they really shouldn't have played. So sometimes they play when they shouldn't have, and then teams can kind of force them to not play when you think they might. It just kind of goes both ways. It's hard to understand all the medical stuff because they're not really obligated to be as transparent as a lot of fans would like when it comes to a lot of this stuff, but we don't know. But at the end of the day, the moral of the story here is the Samsonov contract is good, but it really puts them in an awkward bind with the salary cap, which is going to force another move, and it's likely going to be in the form of a trade. I don't think they have any way around it but moving somebody out. They don't have to rush. They can take their time, see what happens. Obviously if they can buy out Murray, that will be helpful, and they can get away with maybe moving a little bit less money, but it's still not an ideal situation either way. Explains maybe why they were offering Samsonov such a low amount. Maybe it wasn't so much that they didn't feel he was worth it, but more so that they were trying to help him do them a solid, so to speak, into taking a cheaper contract to get through another year of low cap availability. That to me, this is what this sounds like. They're trying to push him to be like, can you just help us out here for one more year? Maybe the year after we're going to have a bigger bump. We'll pay him more. Teams do that. They do. And he didn't want to have it. He wanted to make sure he get paid appropriately this year. Everybody else is doing it. Why shouldn't he? That's the mentality in Toronto, like we said before, with the extensions that are not in place yet for Austin Matthews and William Nylander. It's because everybody's scared to go first and be the guy that leave money on the table. They don't want to be the guy that do it and have your teammates follow suit and do it as well, and you get caught looking like the fool who get paid less. And meanwhile, other teams are worried about winning. And that's not the mentality there. At least that's what it doesn't seem like. So we'll see what happens. But this is going to certainly spawn a trade in Toronto to free up some money. Who's the candidate? Is it Murray, Yarncroke? It's going to be multiple guys. Brody's another one. Or could it be something bigger? Let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments. We'll discuss further. If you're new to the channel, so make sure you subscribe and stick around. We'll keep you up to date with all the news, rumors, analysis of all 32 NHL teams. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.